You ever notice how the wrong assumption can change a man's entire night? The voice on the roadside carried a calm that didn't belong to the flashing red and blue lights washing over the dark Virginia highway. It was just after 9:40 p.m., the kind of humid summer night where the air sat thick against the pavement and the cicadas hummed from the tree line like distant electrical wires. A single black sedan rested on the shoulder of Route 17, its headlights still glowing softly against a row of reflective highway markers spaced every 50 feet along the curve. Officer Daniel Carter stepped out of his patrol cruiser, the door shutting with a firm click that echoed across the quiet road. His boots pressed into the gravel as he approached the car, his posture stiff with the authority of someone who believed he already understood the situation before a single word had been exchanged. The driver's door of the sedan opened slowly, and a tall black man stepped out, steady and unhurried, his movements deliberate as though the moment unfolding in front of him had happened many times before in many different forms. The man was broad-shouldered, dressed simply in a dark jacket and pressed slacks, the faint silver of a military identification badge catching the glow of the patrol car's lights before slipping back into shadow. Carter's eyes moved from the car to the man and then back to the car again, the corners of his mouth tightening slightly. It wasn't the kind of vehicle he expected to see someone important driving. The sedan looked at least 15 years old, its paint worn smooth by time and long miles on American highways. Carter adjusted the radio on his shoulder and spoke in a measured tone that carried just enough skepticism to be noticed. License and registration. The man nodded once and reached into his jacket slowly. Careful, respectful, every motion controlled. He handed over a driver's license and a military identification card. Carter glanced at the license first, then turned the ID over in his hand, reading the name beneath the faint seal of the United States Army. His eyebrows lifted for just a moment. Then he chuckled softly, the sound disappearing into the warm night air. "General, huh?" he said, tilting the card as if the light might reveal something hidden inside it. The man met his gaze without raising his voice. "That's correct." Carter looked back toward the aging sedan parked beside them. The dashboard clock inside still glowed faintly through the windshield. He shook his head slowly. "That's a pretty big title for a guy driving something like this." The man didn't react. Not with anger. Not with embarrassment. Just quiet patience. The kind of patience that came from years of discipline and long flights between distant bases across the world. Carter handed the ID back halfway before pausing, reconsidering something in his mind. The patrol car lights flickered across the pavement again, painting both men in alternating bands of blue and red. "Step over here for a second," Carter said, gesturing toward the cruiser. The man followed without argument, standing beside the vehicle as the radio inside crackled softly with distant chatter from dispatch. A few passing cars slowed as they drove by, their headlights stretching across the scene before disappearing down the highway. Carter studied the identification again under the cruiser's dome light. The name read, Marcus Ellison. Rank, General, United States Army. Carter leaned back slightly and folded his arms. "You understand this looks suspicious, right?" he said. "People pretend to be things they're not all the time." Marcus Ellison remained calm, his hands resting loosely at his sides. He glanced once toward the long stretch of road disappearing into darkness and then back toward the officer. "Officer," he said quietly, "you might want to verify that ID before this goes any further." Carter let out a short laugh, the kind that comes from someone who thinks the story has already been written. "Oh, I will," he said. "Don't worry about that." The radio on his shoulder buzzed again as he reached for the door of the cruiser. Behind them, the highway stretched silent for miles, the only sound the steady hum of insects and the soft ticking of the sedan's cooling engine under the summer sky. Neither man moved for a moment. One believed he had just stopped the wrong person. The other already knew exactly how the night was about to unfold. Officer Daniel Carter stood beside the patrol cruiser with Marcus Ellison's identification card still resting in his hand, the small rectangle of plastic reflecting the rotating red and blue lights like a signal caught between belief and doubt. The name on the card did not change no matter how many times Carter read it. Yet something about the quiet man standing a few feet away did not match the image Carter had already built in his mind. The highway stretched empty for nearly half a mile in both directions, a ribbon of asphalt bordered by tall pine trees and roadside grass that swayed gently in the humid Virginia night. Carter tapped the card once against the edge of the cruiser's open door before glancing again at the sedan parked behind them. The vehicle looked ordinary, almost invisible, the kind of car that passed through small towns without drawing attention, the kind that belonged to teachers, retired mechanics, or someone driving home from a late shift. Carter shook his head slowly and slipped the identification card into the cruiser's dashboard light again. "You know how many fake military IDs we see in a year?" he asked, his voice calm, but edged with skepticism. Marcus Ellison stood with the same composed posture he had carried since stepping out of the sedan, his hands resting loosely at his sides, shoulders straight, eyes steady but not confrontational. The faint glow from the cruiser lights reflected across his jacket and briefly illuminated the silver thread of a small American flag stitched near the collar. "I imagine you see a few," Marcus said quietly. Carter let out a short breath that sounded almost like a laugh, but did not quite reach humor. "More than a few." He turned slightly and looked toward the highway again as another vehicle passed in the distance, its headlights sweeping across the scene before fading back into darkness. Inside the cruiser, the radio murmured with distant dispatch traffic, a low mechanical voice repeating license plate numbers and street intersections from several miles away. Carter leaned one elbow against the door frame and studied Marcus with narrowed eyes. "So let me understand this," he said. "You expect me to believe that a United States Army general is driving down Route 17 alone in a 15-year-old sedan at almost 10 o'clock at night?" Marcus did not immediately respond. The warm summer air carried the scent of pine and heated asphalt as a light breeze moved across the roadside ditch. Somewhere in the trees a night bird called once and then fell silent again. After a moment, Marcus nodded slightly. "Yes." Carter lifted his eyebrows. "That is the story you are going with." Marcus looked briefly toward his car, then back to the officer. "It is not a story." Carter straightened up and walked a slow circle around the front of the cruiser, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. The flashing lights continued their steady rhythm, washing the highway in alternating red and blue pulses that made the entire moment feel suspended between seconds. "Where are you coming from tonight?" Carter asked. "Fort Belvoir," Marcus answered calmly. Carter paused mid-step and looked over his shoulder. "That is about 30 miles from here." "Yes." "And where are you headed?" Marcus glanced toward the long road stretching ahead into darkness. "Home." Carter studied his face for a few seconds longer before stepping back toward the cruiser. The dashboard screen glowed faintly as he placed the identification card beside the radio unit. "You understand why this does not add up," Carter said, lowering himself into the driver's seat. Marcus remained standing beside the cruiser door, his posture still composed, his expression steady. "Officer," he said quietly, "if you run the verification through your system, you will find that everything adds up exactly the way it should." Carter rested one hand on the steering wheel and stared at the computer terminal mounted near the dashboard. For a brief moment, the only sound was the soft clicking of the patrol car engine cooling beneath the hood and the distant hum of insects in the tall grass along the roadside. Carter glanced back up at Marcus again, his expression somewhere between suspicion and mild amusement. "We will see about that," he said. The computer screen flickered as he logged into the system, the glow illuminating his face while he typed the name Marcus Ellison into the database field. Outside the cruiser, Marcus waited quietly beneath the pulsing red and blue lights, the night stretching wide and patient around them as the system began its search. The patrol cruiser computer screen glowed pale blue inside the dark cabin as Officer Daniel Carter leaned slightly forward, his fingers resting on the keyboard while the system processed the name he had just entered. Outside the open driver's side door, Marcus Ellison stood quietly beneath the rotating lights, the steady pulse of red and blue reflecting across the highway like distant warning beacons. The air remained warm and still, the kind of late summer night that held its breath between moments. Carter watched the progress icon spin on the screen, a small circle moving endlessly as the law enforcement database connected to federal records. For several seconds, nothing appeared except a blank search field and a loading symbol. Carter shifted in his seat and glanced through the windshield toward the man standing outside. Marcus had not moved. He stood with the relaxed posture of someone who had spent decades in structured environments where patience was not a choice, but a discipline. His eyes remained calm, watching the quiet road stretching ahead of them. Carter returned his attention to the computer just as the first line of information began to populate on the screen. The system displayed a series of federal verification codes, followed by a name field. Carter leaned closer. The name appeared exactly as printed on the identification card, Marcus Jonathan Ellison. Carter tapped one finger lightly against the steering wheel as more information slowly loaded beneath the name. Branch of service, United States Army. Status, active duty. Clearance level, restricted data redacted. Carter squinted slightly and scrolled down with the mouse wheel, expecting the system to eventually reveal something that confirmed his suspicion. In his experience, unusual situations often had simple explanations hidden somewhere in the fine print. Perhaps the man outside was retired. Perhaps the identification card had expired. Perhaps the system would flag the record as outdated or mismatched. But the next line appeared with unmistakable clarity. Rank, General Officer. Carter frowned. The computer screen refreshed again as the federal network finished synchronizing additional details. A small photograph appeared beside the name, a formal military portrait taken in front of a neutral background. The image showed the same face now standing outside the cruiser door, older perhaps by a few years, but unmistakably the same man. Carter stared at the photograph longer than he expected to. The calm expression in the image matched the quiet patience of the man waiting under the flashing patrol lights. Carter exhaled slowly through his nose and leaned back in the seat. Outside, Marcus glanced briefly toward the computer screen but said nothing. The silence stretched another few seconds while the radio on Carter's shoulder crackled with distant voices from dispatch units across the county. Carter finally stepped out of the cruiser again, leaving the door open behind him. The blue light from the dashboard spilled onto the pavement. Beside his boots. Well, Carter said, folding his arms loosely as he looked at Marcus. Your name is in the system. Marcus nodded slightly. I told you it would be. Carter tilted his head, studying the man again as though seeing him from a slightly different angle now. The sedan behind them remained parked quietly along the shoulder, its headlights still casting a soft beam across the reflective highway markers that lined the curve of the road. Carter glanced toward the car once more before looking back at Marcus. You mind explaining something to me? He asked. Marcus remained composed. What would you like explained? Carter gestured with one hand toward the older vehicle. A man with your rank could drive just about anything he wanted. Yet you are out here in that car. Marcus followed the direction of the gesture and looked at the sedan for a moment. The faint reflection of the patrol lights shimmered across the worn surface of the hood. That car belonged to my father, Marcus said quietly. Carter raised one eyebrow. Your father? Marcus nodded once. He drove it for 20 years. I kept it after he passed away. The wind shifted slightly along the roadside, stirring the tall grass near the ditch. Carter glanced again toward the computer screen glowing inside the cruiser and then back toward Marcus. The certainty he had felt earlier in the evening was no longer quite as solid as it had been 10 minutes ago. But something about the situation still did not sit comfortably with him. Carter rubbed the back of his neck once before speaking again. You said you were coming from Fort Belvoir. Yes. What were you doing there at this hour? Marcus paused briefly before answering. Work does not always follow business hours. Carter studied him for another long moment, the steady rhythm of the patrol lights continuing to wash the roadside in red and blue. Finally, Carter nodded toward the cruiser. I'm going to run one more verification through dispatch, he said. Just to be thorough. Marcus met his gaze calmly. Of course. Carter stepped back toward the open door of the patrol car, unaware that the next few minutes were about to change the quiet certainty he had carried into this stop. Officer Daniel Carter slid back into the driver's seat of the patrol cruiser, leaving the door open as the red and blue lights continued to rotate across the empty stretch of Virginia highway. The computer screen still displayed the federal record tied to the name Marcus Jonathan Ellison, the small official photograph glowing faintly beside the lines of text that confirmed the man's identity. Carter rested one hand on the radio microphone clipped to his shoulder and glanced once more through the windshield at the quiet figure standing outside beneath the pulsing lights. Marcus had not moved. His posture remained steady, hands relaxed at his sides, eyes calm as if the long pause between actions did not trouble him at all. Carter pressed the radio button. Dispatch, this is Unit 12 requesting verification on a federal identification. A brief crackle answered him before a woman's voice responded through the speaker. Go ahead, Unit 12. Carter read the name slowly, each word deliberate. Marcus Jonathan Ellison, possible United States Army General Officer. I need confirmation through federal channel. The radio fell silent for a moment while the request moved through the system. Carter leaned back slightly and glanced again toward Marcus. The man stood in the same place near the edge of the shoulder, the soft beam of his sedan's headlights stretching across the reflective markers that lined the curve of the road ahead. For a moment the scene felt strangely still, as if the entire highway had paused to watch what would happen next. The radio finally crackled again. Unit 12, stand by while we route that request. Carter acknowledged with a short response and rested his elbow against the door frame. The night air carried the steady hum of insects and the faint rustling of leaves high in the pine trees along the roadside. A pair of headlights appeared far in the distance before disappearing down a connecting road nearly half a mile away. Carter tapped the steering wheel once while waiting. Outside, Marcus looked briefly toward the cruiser, the faint glow from the dashboard reflecting in his eyes before he turned his gaze back toward the dark road ahead. Several minutes passed before the radio came alive again, this time with a slightly different tone in the dispatcher's voice. Unit 12, Federal Channel confirms the name you provided exists in the Department of Defense Registry. However, the clearance details are restricted. They are requesting the reason for the verification. Carter straightened in his seat. Routine traffic stop. He answered. Subject presented military identification claiming general rank. There was another pause on the line. Carter could hear faint keyboard clicks from the dispatch center through the open speaker. The seconds stretched longer than expected. Finally, the voice returned. Unit 12, Federal Channel is requesting that you hold the subject while they complete additional verification. Carter frowned slightly at the wording. Hold the subject. He repeated quietly to himself. He looked through the open door again toward Marcus. The man remained composed, waiting without impatience as if he had already anticipated the next step in the process. Carter stepped out of the cruiser again and closed the door behind him, the red and blue lights flashing across the highway shoulder in slow rhythm. They want a little more confirmation, Carter said. Standard procedure. Marcus nodded calmly. Take whatever time you need. Carter studied him for a moment longer before speaking again. You do not seem very concerned about all of this. Marcus's expression remained even. Concern does not make the process faster. Carter let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh. The calm confidence in the man's voice unsettled him slightly, though he could not explain exactly why. The radio inside the cruiser crackled again, louder this time. Carter turned back toward the vehicle just as the dispatcher's voice called out urgently. Unit 12, Federal Channel is requesting direct contact with the subject if possible. Carter hesitated for a fraction of a second before walking back to the cruiser and reaching for the radio microphone. The highway remained silent around them, the distant tree line standing like a dark wall beneath the wide Virginia sky. Carter lifted the microphone, but paused before pressing the transmit button. Something about the request felt unusual. Slowly he turned his head and looked once more at Marcus Ellison standing calmly beside the road, the flashing patrol lights painting his silhouette in alternating shades of red and blue while the quiet night waited for the next move. Officer Daniel Carter held the radio microphone for a moment longer than necessary, his eyes still fixed on Marcus Ellison standing calmly beside the quiet highway shoulder. The request from Federal Channel echoed in his mind. They wanted direct contact with the subject. That was not something that happened during ordinary traffic stops. Carter pressed the transmit button slowly. Dispatch, confirm Federal Channel wants to speak with the driver directly. The response came almost immediately. Affirmative, Unit 12. They are requesting the subject's voice confirmation. Carter lowered the microphone and looked across the hood of the cruiser toward Marcus again. The flashing patrol lights painted the pavement with slow-moving waves of red and blue while the humid Virginia air hung heavy and still around them. For several seconds neither man spoke. Carter finally stepped away from the cruiser and approached Marcus with a measured pace, the gravel along the roadside crunching under his boots. They want to hear from you, Carter said, gesturing toward the radio. Marcus nodded once, his expression unchanged. That will be fine. Carter hesitated slightly before handing him the microphone. The small device looked almost insignificant in Marcus's hand, but the calm confidence in the man's posture made the moment feel larger than it appeared. Marcus lifted the microphone toward his mouth. "This is Marcus Ellison," he said in a steady voice. "Please advise." The radio remained silent for 2 seconds, then 3. Carter watched closely, the tension in his shoulders tightening as the dispatcher's voice returned. But the voice that answered was not the same dispatcher from before. It was deeper, more formal, carrying the controlled tone of someone accustomed to command structures and official channels. "General Ellison, this is Federal Operations Verification. Please confirm your service branch and active command." Marcus did not look surprised by the question. "United States Army," he replied calmly. "Active duty command assignment within Northern Operations Division." Carter's eyebrows lifted slightly. The voice on the radio responded without hesitation. "Verification acknowledged." There was a brief pause before the voice continued, now directed clearly toward Officer Carter. "Unit 12, you are advised that the individual you have detained is confirmed as an active United States Army general officer. Further instructions will follow." Carter felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere around him, though the quiet road and flashing lights remained exactly the same. He cleared his throat once before speaking toward the microphone. "Understood." Marcus returned the radio to Carter without a word and stepped back to the same place he had been standing before. Carter took the microphone and clipped it back onto his shoulder. For the first time since initiating the stop, the certainty he had carried with him began to feel less stable. The highway remained silent except for the low murmur of the cruiser engine and the steady chorus of insects in the trees. Carter folded his arms briefly and looked toward the older sedan again. "You could have mentioned that earlier," he said. Marcus met his gaze calmly. "You did not ask the right questions." Carter let out a quiet breath through his nose. The words were not disrespectful, yet they carried a subtle weight that made him reconsider the situation unfolding around them. The radio crackled again suddenly, louder than before. Carter turned quickly and lifted the microphone. The same federal voice returned, this time sharper and more direct. "Unit 12, Federal Command requests that the subject be allowed immediate communication access." Carter glanced at Marcus again, then back at the radio. "Communication access for what purpose?" he asked. The answer came without delay. "The subject is authorized to place one call through secured federal channel if necessary." Carter lowered the microphone slowly, the meaning of the instructions settling in piece by piece. The quiet confidence Marcus had carried since the beginning of the stop now made more sense than Carter wanted to admit. He turned and looked directly at the man beside the road. Marcus stood exactly where he had been all along, patient, calm, almost as if he had been waiting for this exact moment since the patrol lights first appeared in his rearview mirror. Carter took a breath before speaking again. "They say you are allowed one call." Marcus gave a small nod, his voice even and controlled. "Yes," he said, "that will be enough." The flashing patrol lights continued to rotate across the empty highway as Carter realized the night was no longer unfolding according to the assumptions he had made only 20 minutes earlier. The night along Route 17 had grown quieter, as if the highway itself had begun to listen. Officer Daniel Carter stood beside the patrol cruiser with the radio microphone resting against his shoulder, the words from Federal Command still echoing in his mind. The subject was authorized to place one call. The flashing red and blue lights continued to roll across the pavement in slow pulses, reflecting off the worn hood of the older sedan and the tall reflective markers that lined the edge of the road. Marcus Ellison remained calm where he stood, his posture steady, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the dark stretch of asphalt ahead. There was no urgency in his movements, no visible frustration in his expression. Instead, there was a quiet patience that suggested the moment unfolding now had already been accounted for long before the patrol cruiser lights appeared behind him 20 minutes earlier. Carter stepped closer, studying the man more carefully than he had at the beginning of the stop. The calm confidence was not arrogance. It was something else, something practiced. The kind of composure that came from years of command decisions made in rooms where every second carried weight. Carter cleared his throat slightly. "You can make your call," he said. Marcus nodded once, as if the confirmation simply aligned with what he had already expected. "Thank you," he replied quietly. Carter hesitated for a moment before reaching toward the cruiser. He unlocked the small console compartment and removed a department-issued phone used for secure communication during unusual cases. The device looked ordinary, but its connection ran through the same federal channels that had just confirmed Marcus's identity. Carter handed the phone over. Marcus accepted it with steady hands and glanced briefly at the screen. For several seconds, he did not dial anything. He simply looked down at the keypad as though considering the exact order of the next step. The highway remained silent except for the low mechanical hum of the patrol car engine and the distant rhythm of insects hidden in the tall grass along the roadside. Carter watched closely, unsure whether the call would simply end the stop or complicate it further. Finally, Marcus entered a number. The phone rang once, then twice. On the third ring, the call connected. Marcus lifted the device to his ear. "General Ellison speaking," he said in a calm, measured voice. Carter could not hear the response on the other end, but something about the brief pause that followed changed the atmosphere around them. Marcus's posture remained composed, yet there was a subtle shift in the air as though the night itself had taken a quiet breath. "Yes," Marcus continued. "I am currently on Route 17, approximately 12 miles north of Fredericksburg." Carter felt his attention sharpen at the words. Marcus listened again for several seconds before speaking once more. "No, there is no immediate problem," he said evenly. "However, the situation may require clarification through your office." The wind moved gently through the pine trees beside the road, causing a soft rustling sound that blended with the steady pulse of the patrol lights. Carter folded his arms and watched as Marcus listened to the voice on the other end of the call. Another pause followed. Marcus nodded slightly, even though the person on the line could not see the gesture. "Understood," he said. "Yes, that would be appropriate." Carter shifted his weight slightly, the gravel beneath his boots crunching softly. The quiet confidence that had seemed unusual earlier now felt deliberate, almost strategic. Marcus lowered the phone slightly, but did not end the call yet. "I will remain here," he said into the receiver. "Thank you." The line disconnected a moment later. Marcus looked down at the phone screen briefly before returning the device to Carter. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The highway stretched empty beneath the wide Virginia sky, the flashing patrol lights still painting the road in steady waves of color. Carter took the phone slowly, his eyes searching Marcus's face for some hint of what had just been set in motion. Marcus met his gaze calmly. "Someone will be arriving shortly," he said. Carter frowned slightly. "Arriving from where?" Marcus answered without hesitation. "The Pentagon." The words hung quietly in the warm night air as the distant highway remained silent, waiting for whatever would come next. The words settled into the warm Virginia night like a quiet signal sent far beyond the dark stretch of highway. "Someone will be arriving shortly." The Pentagon. Officer Daniel Carter stood beside the patrol cruiser, holding the department phone. Marcus Ellison had just returned, his eyes fixed on the calm expression of the man in front of him. For a moment, Carter almost expected Marcus to smile or offer some explanation that would turn the statement into something less serious. But Marcus simply remained where he was, hands resting loosely at his sides, gaze steady beneath the rotating red and blue patrol lights. The highway remained empty in both directions, the long curve of Route 17 disappearing into shadow beneath tall pine trees that lined the roadside like silent witnesses. Carter glanced down the road once, then back toward Marcus. "You were saying someone is coming all the way from Washington tonight," Carter said slowly. Marcus nodded once. "Yes." Carter exhaled quietly through his nose and leaned against the side of the cruiser, folding his arms while the patrol lights continued to sweep across the asphalt. The distance between Fredericksburg and Washington was not small. Even at highway speed, it would take time. Carter looked again toward the dark road ahead, as if expecting headlights to appear immediately. Nothing moved except the occasional ripple of wind through the roadside grass. Several minutes passed in silence. The radio on Carter's shoulder remained quiet for the first time since the stop began. Even the dispatcher's usual background chatter had faded, leaving only the mechanical hum of the cruiser engine and the faint ticking sound from the cooling metal of Marcus's sedan parked behind them. Carter shifted his weight slightly, still studying Marcus. The man had not asked to leave. He had not questioned the delay. Instead, he waited with the calm patience of someone who understood that the outcome of the situation no longer depended on either of them standing beside the road. Carter finally spoke again. You do realize most people would be a little more nervous in your position. Marcus looked toward him briefly. Most people are not used to waiting. Carter gave a small half-laugh that faded quickly. The quiet confidence in Marcus's voice was not confrontational, but it carried a certainty that made the long stretch of silence feel heavier than before. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. The sky above the highway had grown darker as the last traces of twilight disappeared beyond the tree line. The flashing patrol lights reflected off the road markers in slow rhythmic pulses, turning the empty pavement into a repeating pattern of red and blue streaks stretching into the distance. Carter checked the time on the cruiser dashboard and looked down the road again. This time he noticed something different. At the far end of the highway curve, nearly a mile away, a faint glow appeared between the trees. At first it looked like ordinary headlights. Then another set appeared behind it. Carter straightened slightly, his arms unfolding without him noticing. The distant lights grew brighter as the vehicles approached, their beams reflecting sharply off the roadside markers one after another like a chain of signals lighting up the dark road. Marcus watched quietly, without moving. The first vehicle reached the long straight section of highway, and Carter could now clearly see its shape. It was not a civilian sedan or a delivery truck. It was a dark government SUV moving steadily toward them, followed by another vehicle behind it. The lead SUV slowed as it approached the flashing patrol lights, its headlights cutting through the red and blue glow before the driver guided it carefully onto the shoulder a few yards ahead of the cruiser. The second vehicle stopped directly behind it. Carter remained still beside the patrol car as both SUV doors opened. Two figures stepped out, their movements calm and deliberate. Even from several yards away, the posture of the individuals carried the unmistakable formality of military presence. Carter felt the quiet certainty he had carried earlier in the evening dissolve completely as the first figure walked forward beneath the glow of the patrol lights. Marcus Ellison remained where he stood beside the road, watching the approaching vehicles with the same calm expression he had held since the moment the stop began. The doors of the dark government SUVs closed with a quiet, solid sound that carried across the still highway. The rotating red and blue lights from the patrol cruiser washed over the vehicles in slow waves, reflecting across the polished black surfaces like ripples of color in the night. Officer Daniel Carter remained beside his cruiser, his arms slowly lowering to his sides as the two figures stepped forward from the lead vehicle. Even before they reached the glow of the patrol lights, their posture revealed the unmistakable structure of military discipline. The taller of the two men walked in front, his stride steady and measured, his presence carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to command. As he stepped fully into the light, the insignia on his uniform jacket became visible, the polished pins catching flashes of red and blue as he approached. Carter straightened instinctively. Years of training had taught him to recognize rank even outside military environments, and the decorations across the officer's chest made it clear this was not an ordinary visit. The man stopped several feet away and looked first toward Marcus Ellison before turning his attention to Carter. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and controlled. "Good evening." Carter nodded once, his earlier certainty replaced by careful professionalism. "Evening." The officer's eyes moved briefly to the patrol cruiser, then back to Marcus. "General Ellison." Marcus gave a slight nod in return, the same composed expression still on his face. The two men exchanged a brief look that carried the quiet familiarity of colleagues who had worked within the same chain of command for years. Carter noticed the subtle shift in the atmosphere as the moment settled. The military officer turned back toward him. "I am Colonel Andrew Whitaker," he said evenly. "United States Army Liaison Office." Carter glanced briefly toward the second SUV where another uniformed individual remained standing beside the vehicle, observing quietly, but saying nothing. Whitaker continued speaking with calm clarity. "General Ellison contacted Federal Command regarding this situation." Carter nodded once. "Routine stop," he said carefully. "Verification process." Whitaker acknowledged the explanation with a slight tilt of his head. "Understood." The colonel then turned slightly toward Marcus again, his tone respectful. "General, everything is confirmed." Marcus gave a small nod. "Thank you for coming." Carter stood silently for a moment while the meaning of the exchange settled in. The night air remained warm and still, the hum of insects continuing in the roadside trees while the patrol lights cast long shadows across the pavement. Whitaker turned back toward Carter again. "Officer, the Department of Defense confirms General Ellison's active command status. His identification and clearance have already been verified through federal channel." Carter felt the words land heavier than he expected. Earlier that evening the stop had seemed routine, even simple. Now the quiet stretch of Route 17 had become the center of something far more official than he had imagined. Carter nodded slowly. "Understood." Whitaker studied him briefly before continuing in a measured tone that carried neither anger nor accusation. "General Ellison is currently involved in ongoing operational responsibilities connected to nearby installations. His travel tonight was part of that schedule." Carter glanced once toward the older sedan parked behind them, the same car he had questioned earlier. Whitaker followed his gaze and allowed a small, knowing smile to appear. "The general prefers to keep a low profile." Marcus said nothing, but the faintest hint of amusement appeared in his eyes. Carter cleared his throat once and looked back toward the colonel. "Everything checks out then?" Whitaker nodded. "Yes." The colonel then turned slightly and gestured toward the dark SUVs waiting beside the road. "We will escort the general from here." Carter watched quietly as Whitaker stepped aside, giving Marcus space to move toward the sedan. Marcus paused briefly before opening the driver's side door, then looked once more toward Carter. The calm composure remained in his voice. "Officer Carter." Carter met his gaze. "Yes, sir." Marcus spoke evenly, without bitterness or accusation. "Verification matters." Carter nodded once. "Yes, sir, it does." Marcus closed the sedan door gently after stepping inside. Moments later the engine started, its soft hum blending with the quiet sounds of the highway. The two government SUVs repositioned themselves, one ahead of the sedan and one behind, their headlights cutting through the darkness as the small convoy prepared to leave the roadside. Carter remained beside the patrol cruiser watching as the vehicles slowly pulled back onto the empty highway and disappeared into the long curve of Route 17, leaving only the fading reflection of headlights and the steady rhythm of his cruiser's lights against the quiet Virginia night. The convoy of dark government vehicles disappeared slowly into the long curve of Route 17, their headlights fading until the highway returned to the quiet darkness that had filled the night before the stop began. Officer Daniel Carter stood beside his patrol cruiser for several seconds after the last vehicle vanished from sight. The rotating red and blue lights continued to sweep across the empty road, casting long shadows across the pavement and the tall roadside grass. For the first time in nearly an hour, the highway felt still again. The steady chorus of insects returned from the tree line, as if the night had been waiting for the interruption to pass. Carter let out a slow breath and looked down the road where the convoy had been only moments earlier. The silence carried a weight that had not been there before. He walked back toward the open driver's side door of the cruiser and glanced inside at the computer screen that still displayed the federal verification record. The name Marcus Jonathan Ellison remained visible beneath the small portrait photograph and the lines of official information. Carter stared at the screen for a moment before reaching forward and closing the record window. The display returned to the standard patrol interface, the soft glow illuminating the interior of the vehicle while the engine hummed quietly beneath the hood. Carter rested his hands on the edge of the door frame and looked out across the highway again. Earlier that evening he had stepped out of the cruiser, certain he understood the situation in front of him. A car on the roadside. A driver who did not appear to match the expectations formed in his mind. A routine stop. But the quiet stretch of Virginia highway had turned into something far different than routine. The flashing patrol lights reflected across the asphalt one more time before Carter reached through the window and switched them off. Instantly the road fell into darkness again, illuminated only by the pale glow of the cruiser headlights and the distant stars scattered across the sky above the tree line. Carter leaned against the side of the vehicle for a moment, replaying the conversation in his mind. Marcus Ellison had never raised his voice. He had never argued. He had simply waited. The calm patience carried by the general had been there from the beginning, long before the call, long before the arrival of the government vehicles. Carter thought about the older sedan as well, the worn paint and quiet engine that had seemed so out of place when he first approached it. Now it made a different kind of sense. Some people carried their rank loudly, with polished cars and visible symbols of authority. Others carried it quietly, in the way they spoke and the way they waited. Carter pushed himself upright and walked slowly around the front of the cruiser. The long highway stretched empty beneath the dark sky, the reflective road markers glowing faintly in the distance. Somewhere beyond the curve, the convoy was already miles away, moving toward Washington through the quiet night. Carter paused for a moment beside the passenger side door and looked once more down the road. The words Marcus had spoken before leaving echoed again in his mind. Verification matters. Carter nodded slightly to himself. In his line of work, the phrase usually meant confirming documents, checking identification, making sure procedures were followed. But tonight the meaning had felt larger than that. Sometimes verification meant looking beyond assumptions that formed too quickly in the dark beside a quiet highway. Carter returned to the driver's seat and closed the door. The interior of the cruiser filled with the familiar glow of dashboard lights and the low hum of electronics reconnecting to the patrol network. He adjusted the radio microphone on his shoulder and glanced one last time through the windshield at the empty road ahead. Then he shifted the vehicle into drive. The cruiser rolled slowly back onto the highway, the tires moving smoothly across the pavement as Carter continued his patrol through the quiet Virginia night.